The morning mist clung to the barbed wire like a shroud, cold and unyielding. Inside the compound, the women huddled in their thin, tattered coats, the wind cutting through the wooden barracks like a knife. Every footstep outside the walls echoed like a warning. Somewhere a guard barked orders, his voice sharp, unforgiving. Fear had become their constant companion. Among them, Anna pressed her back against the frost-covered wall, counting the hours since last night's roll call. Each glance at the clock reminded her of the unbearable monotony of waiting for food, for news, for the next round of punishments. Beside her, Margot clutched a worn photograph, her mother's face smiling back at her, a fragile anchor to a world that seemed impossibly far away. Life in the camp was measured in rules, punishments, and whispers. The thin soup barely filled their stomachs, and the straw mattresses offered little warmth. Guards patrolled relentlessly, eyes scanning for the smallest sign of defiance. One wrong word, one misstep could bring hours of brutal labor, or worse, yet beneath the fear, sparks of hope lingered. Anna and Margot shared secret glances, silent promises that they would endure, that they would survive. Each whispered conversation, each stolen moment of laughter, became a rebellion in itself, a quiet defiance against the suffocating darkness surrounding them. As the sun barely pierced the grey sky, a distant rumble rolled through the camp, and a shiver ran through the women. Something was coming, something that might change everything. The rumors started quietly, whispered between the cracks of the barracks, carried in half-formed sentences that trembled with disbelief. "I heard the Americans are close," one woman murmured as she mended her worn coat. Anna's ears perked at the words, heart hammering. Could it really be true? Good freedom, a word they had scarcely dared to speak aloud for years, finally be within reach. The women huddled together that evening, shadows flickering on the walls from the single lantern burning low. Margot traced her fingers along the seam of a uniform, her voice barely audible. "They say Canada's taking prisoners. After the camps are cleared. A place far away where the war hasn't reached, where we might be safe." She looked up, eyes wide with a fragile hope. Some of the others scoffed quietly, unwilling to allow themselves belief, but the seed had been planted. Night after night, whispers grew bolder. Stories of Allied advances, of German soldiers abandoning posts, spread like sparks through dry grass. The women passed scraps of news from one barrack to another, always careful, always glancing over their shoulders. Every rumor was a gamble. Too much excitement could draw the guards' suspicion. Too much silence could choke the fragile hope swelling in their hearts. In the dim light, camaraderie became a shield. Anna shared bread she had saved from the morning ration with a younger girl named Liesel, whose hands trembled from hunger and fear. Margot offered words of comfort to those too timid to speak, recounting letters she imagined she would someday write, letters she would never send. The women began to lean on each other in ways they hadn't before, laughter and tears mingling in secret, tiny rebellions against the darkness surrounding them. Historical tales filtered into the camp like lifelines. They spoke of Canada, a distant land where the Allies had promised refuge to those who had suffered under the Axis powers. Though the details were hazy, who would take them, when, under what circumstances, it was a thread of light, a vision of green fields and open skies contrasting sharply with the grey, frozen confines of the camp. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine life outside the wire, life without the endless fear of punishment or hunger. Tension, however, was never far. The distant rumble of artillery on the horizon reminded them that the world outside the camp was still at war. Some nights, gunfire cracked sharply across the dark fields, echoing closer each time, rattling hearts and shaking fragile courage. Every new sound of battle brought a mixture of fear and anticipation, fear that the fighting could turn back against them, anticipation that it might finally signal the collapse of their captors. In those tense hours, small acts of courage began to emerge. A group of women would sneak extra rations back to their friends in other barracks. Another would quietly comfort a new prisoner, whispering instructions and stories to help her survive the first brutal days. Even Anna, who had spent months silently observing and surviving, found herself whispering along, passing on hints of what she had learned. Little pieces of hope that made survival feel possible. And then, one evening, a new sound arrived, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the earth itself. The women pressed their ears to the cold floorboards, eyes wide. Horse-drawn carts, trucks, voices shouting in a foreign tongue. Could it be them? Could liberation really be on the way? The thrum grew louder, closer. Some of the women's hands shook uncontrollably. Others gripped each other, whispering prayers and wishes, barely daring to hope aloud. Margot's voice broke the tense silence. "Anna, maybe it's really happening. Maybe—" Her words trailed off. But in the pause, the possibility hung like a fragile crystal, shimmering with promise. Anna's stomach twisted with equal parts fear and longing. What if it was a trap? What if the guards had heard the whispers and were preparing something worse? Yet beneath the fear, a spark of exhilaration began to grow, impossible to snuff out. The night stretched on, shadows of hope and anxiety intertwined, until finally, exhaustion claimed them. But even in their restless sleep, dreams were different now. Dreams of freedom, dreams of green fields and cold, crisp Canadian air. Dreams that whispered, tantalizingly, that the world beyond the barbed wire existed, and that they might walk in it someday. As the first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows, a distant roar of engines broke the fragile stillness. The women stirred, hearts pounding in unison. Something was approaching, something that could change everything. The dawn was restless, tinged with the smell of smoke and the distant echoes of gunfire. For years, the women had measured their days by the strict cadence of the camp. Wake, roll call, forced labor, meager rations, and endless fear. But that morning, the rhythm of captivity was shattered. The barbed wire no longer seemed impenetrable. The guards scurried like frightened animals, unsure of the forces advancing from beyond the hills. Anna could hardly believe her eyes as Allied soldiers poured through the gates, rifles raised but faces worn with fatigue rather than cruelty. The harsh bark of commands was replaced by shouts of relief, laughter, and tears. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, and the women stared at one another, trying to process the impossible. They were free. Chaos followed quickly. Crowds surged through the camp as the prisoners were gathered for evacuation. There were hurried searches, frantic instructions, and a flurry of shouted questions in languages many of the women could barely understand. Anna clutched Margot's arm, their hands tight, hearts pounding in unison. Freedom, they realized, was not a gentle gift. It was a jolt, a collision of hope and fear. The journey north began with trains, the old wooden cars rattling over fractured tracks. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with sweat, fear, and the faint smell of damp straw. Food was scarce. Each ration was carefully divided and passed along, yet hunger gnawed relentlessly. Some women murmured prayers, others stared silently at the walls, tracing cracks as though they could map a path to safety. At night, the train would stop unexpectedly, leaving them stranded in small, bombed-out stations or open fields. Each halt was a test of endurance, cold winds biting through threadbare coats, the distant thrum of artillery a reminder that the war had not ended. Soldiers moved quickly among them, distributing water and blankets, yet there was little time for comfort. The women learned quickly to keep their fear contained, to fold it into smiles or quiet whispers, lest panic spread through the cars like wildfire. And yet, even amid the hardship, moments of human tenderness emerged. Margot found an old scarf and wrapped it around a shivering girl's shoulders. Anna shared a piece of dried bread with another prisoner who had gone days without proper food. They laughed quietly at small jokes, whispers that seemed trivial against the backdrop of war, but became lifelines in the darkness. Each act of kindness was a small rebellion against the brutality they had endured. The landscape outside the windows shifted slowly. Ruined towns gave way to dense forests, and forests to rivers that shimmered under the late autumn sun. Soldiers spoke in hurried tones of reaching Canada, of Allied relief programs, and of the hope that lay across the ocean. For the first time, the women could imagine a life not measured in rations, roll calls, and punishments, but each passing mile was also a reminder of how far they were from home, and how uncertain the future remained. Conversations turned to dreams, hesitant and fragile. Some spoke of Canada as if it were a magical place, a land untouched by bombs and gunfire. They imagined broad fields, cold lakes, and towns where people smiled without suspicion. Others feared the unknown, wondering if their freedom would come at the cost of being utterly alone in a foreign land. The mixture of exhilaration and anxiety created a tension that neither food nor sleep could fully ease. Anna remembered the first time they caught sight of the Canadian transport ships waiting at the port. The enormous vessels, loaded with supplies and troops, seemed impossibly large, almost surreal. Boarding them required patience and courage. The women had to step carefully over crates and debris, clinging to one another as the wind howled across the deck. For the first time, the vastness of freedom was tangible, yet intimidating. Sleep was fitful, dreams haunted by the shadows of captivity. Anna woke to Margot's whisper, trembling, "Do you think we'll make it?" Anna wanted to answer with certainty, but the truth was unknown. The seas were rough, the journey long, and the war was not entirely over. Yet even in her doubt, Anna felt the spark of hope that had carried them this far, a fragile thread connecting them to the life they were racing toward. Days passed in a blur of motion, salt air, and endless waves. Each meal, each blanket, each friendly face among the soldiers became a symbol of a world that could exist beyond fear. And still, uncertainty lingered. Would they be welcomed in Canada? Could they rebuild their lives? Or would the weight of memory and loss follow them across the ocean, shadowing even the brightest horizon? Finally, as the ship approached the icy Canadian coastline, a hush fell over the women. For months, years even, they had lived in the shadows of fear. Now, standing on the deck, staring at snow-dusted hills and evergreen forests stretching into the distance, they felt something they had scarcely allowed themselves to imagine: freedom. But even in this moment of triumph, they clung to each other, hearts pounding with the knowledge that the journey had only begun, and that the next steps would test their courage in ways they could not yet foresee. The first glimpse of Canada was almost surreal. Anna pressed her hands against the frosted railing of the ship, eyes wide as the snow-dusted hills and endless stretches of evergreen forests unfolded before her. It was vast, silent, and breathtaking, a stark contrast to the grey, suffocating confines of the camp she had left behind. Margot stood beside her, shivering, but her lips curved into a tentative smile. After years of darkness, the light of a new world seemed almost too bright to believe. As the women disembarked, they were met by a small throng of Canadian volunteers, their faces kind but lined with the weariness of those who had lived through their own war struggles. Warm coats were handed to trembling hands, blankets draped over shoulders that had long gone cold, and small packages of food offered to hungry mouths. The gestures were simple, yet to the women they felt monumental, a welcome they had scarcely dared to imagine. The towns themselves seemed lifted from a dream. Wooden homes painted in cheerful colors lined quiet streets. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and children's laughter rang through the crisp air. Anna's heart swelled at the normalcy, the ordinary rhythm of life that had once seemed unimaginable. Yet beneath the wonder lay uncertainty. How would they fit into this world? Would anyone understand the depths of what they had endured? The resettlement programs were carefully organized. Families who had volunteered to host refugees opened their homes with patience and warmth. Anna and Margot were placed with a couple in a small town near the Great Lakes. The house was modest, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot, and windows that framed snow-covered fields like paintings. The couple offered tea, blankets, and gentle smiles, speaking slowly so the women could understand, their kindness a balm to years of fear. Even amid the hospitality, challenges quickly became apparent. Daily routines in this new life were foreign and intimidating. Simple tasks, cooking, cleaning, navigating local shops, felt overwhelming. Rules that had once been simple, like curfews in the camp, were gone, leaving the women disoriented in a freedom they had never truly known. And sleep brought its own trials. Nightmares returned, vivid memories of roll calls, hunger and punishment, reminding them that the past could not simply be left behind. Yet hope began to take root in subtle ways. Anna marveled at the vast forests, imagining walks without fear. Margot took tentative steps into the kitchen, learning to prepare meals on a stove that didn't ration her movements or resources. Conversations with neighbors, though awkward and halting, gradually became exchanges of laughter, curiosity, and connection. The women began to sense that freedom was not just a destination, it was a skill they could learn, a new life they could shape. Small rituals became symbols of their reclamation. A shared cup of tea in the morning, letters written in longhand to family far away, walks along snow-crusted paths. Each act was a testament to resilience. They celebrated each tiny victory, from learning local idioms to mastering a grocery list, knowing that each step forward was a step away from the shadows of the camp. But the contrast was never far from their minds. In quiet moments, Anna would glance at the serene fields outside and feel the lingering ache of absence. Friends lost, family gone, a homeland that seemed simultaneously near and unreachable. Margot often sat by the window at dusk, tracing her fingers along the frost, letting tears fall freely for the years stolen, the fears endured. Freedom was beautiful, but it was not simple. It carried the weight of memory, and with it, the quiet vigilance of survival instincts honed in captivity. The women began to form small communities among themselves, sharing experiences, advice, and comfort. In the evenings, they would gather to speak of what the future might hold, exchanging dreams of education, work, and families. The Canadian hosts listened patiently, offering support without judgment, helping the women navigate a world that was as alien as it was promising. As the first winter deepened, the women started to feel a tentative sense of belonging. The forests that had once seemed vast and intimidating became places of quiet wonder. The snow, harsh at first, became a playground of new experiences, a symbol that life could still hold joy after suffering. And though the past would never fade completely, each sunrise brought with it the possibility of healing, the promise that freedom was more than escape. It was a chance to live again. By the time the first thaw approached, Anna and Margot could walk through the streets of their new town with heads held high, hearts still carrying shadows, but minds filled with cautious hope. Canada was no longer a distant dream. It was a living, breathing reality, waiting to be explored, claimed, and loved. Yet even in this wonder, the women knew their journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight within themselves, memories to reconcile, and identities to rebuild. And so, the snow-crusted streets, the gentle Canadian winds, and the welcoming faces became not just a home, but a training ground for freedom itself. Winter slowly eased into spring, and with the thaw, the women began to feel the first tentative stirrings of a life they could call their own. The streets of their Canadian town were no longer strange. The houses, the laughter of children, the smell of fresh-baked bread from neighborhood ovens, all of it became familiar, even comforting. Yet for Anna, Margot, and the others, freedom was a careful dance between hope and memory, a daily struggle to rebuild lives fractured by years of captivity. The first steps were small. Anna learned to navigate the local market, her hands brushing against fruits and vegetables that seemed almost too plentiful to touch. The idea that she could choose what to eat and when was dizzying. Margot took classes offered by the resettlement program, basic bookkeeping, sewing, and English literacy. She marveled at how much she had forgotten, how much she had to relearn, but each lesson was a small triumph, proof that the war could not take everything from her. Friendships blossomed slowly, often in unexpected ways. Anna found companionship in Liesel, another former prisoner, as they worked together sorting supplies at the town's community center. They laughed quietly over missteps, teasing one another about awkward pronunciations and forgotten words. Margot grew close to Mrs. Thompson, the Canadian woman who had first welcomed her into her home. They baked bread side by side, exchanging stories of family, of struggles, and of resilience. These connections were fragile at first, tentative bridges across a chasm of shared trauma, but they became lifelines. Still, recovery was never linear. PTSD visited unannounced, striking in the middle of a bustling street or during a quiet evening by the fire. A sudden scream in the distance, the clatter of falling dishes, even a raised voice could send a wave of fear crashing over them. Nights were particularly difficult. Dreams of roll calls, hunger, and punishment returned with vivid intensity. Anna would wake screaming, her body trembling, and Margot would hold her, whispering reminders that the world had changed, that they were safe now. Homesickness lingered as well. Letters from family were slow to arrive, if at all. Friends from the camp who had survived were scattered across Europe, some heading to new countries, some lost entirely. The weight of these absences pressed down on the women, a subtle ache beneath the excitement of new beginnings. Yet they learned to carry it alongside hope, letting it inform their gratitude rather than drown it. Work became a path to healing. Anna found employment at the local library, cataloguing books and helping children learn to read. The quiet order of the shelves, the smell of old paper, the smiles of young students, these were small anchors to a life no longer dominated by fear. Margot joined a sewing cooperative, mending clothes for neighbors, and slowly she discovered a rhythm, a purpose beyond mere survival. Each completed task, each nod of approval became a victory, a reminder that life could be more than just enduring, it could be meaningful. Laughter began to return, quiet at first, then louder, more genuine. One afternoon, Anna and Liesel tried ice skating on a frozen pond, clumsily gripping one another to keep from falling. Margot watched from the shore, clapping as the younger women wobbled and laughed until tears streamed down their faces. These moments, seemingly trivial, were revolutionary. They were proof that joy could exist again, even after so much loss. Personal milestones added to the sense of reclamation. Some women pursued education, enrolling in local schools or vocational programs. Others formed romantic relationships, tentative and fragile, yet imbued with the promise of normalcy. Community projects provided another avenue for healing, helping rebuild a playground, organizing charity drives, or teaching younger generations about resilience and courage. Each accomplishment was layered with emotional weight, the knowledge that every small success was a defiance of the years they had lost. Yet, even amidst these victories, the past lingered. Anna sometimes caught herself staring out the window for hours, lost in memories of friends left behind, of camp gates, of the barbed wire that had confined them for so long. Margot wrote letters she never sent, recounting the faces of those who had not survived, and in those private moments, the shadows of captivity reminded them that healing was ongoing, and still the women pressed forward. With each day, they grew stronger, more capable of navigating a world that had once seemed impossible. They celebrated each other's triumphs as their own, whether it was mastering a new skill, receiving a kind word from a neighbor, or simply surviving a night without the weight of fear pressing down on their chests. By the time summer arrived, the women had begun to carve out lives rich with possibility. They had discovered that freedom was not simply the absence of bars or guards. It was the ability to choose, to connect, to rebuild, to hope. And though the shadows of the past remained, the laughter, the work, and the small victories provided a beacon, a proof that life could still be beautiful, even after years of darkness. Even in the calm of Canadian spring, the shadows of the past clung stubbornly. For many of the women, freedom was a double-edged sword. Nights brought restless sleep, haunted by vivid memories of the camp, The cold wooden floors, the relentless roll calls, the sharp crack of the guards' boots echoing in their minds. Anna would wake with her heart racing, the echoes of past terror blending with the silence of her safe room. Margot often found herself staring at the ceiling, hands trembling, replaying moments she wished she could erase. Letters from family carried both comfort and pain. Anna received one from a distant cousin, recounting small events from home, but it also contained news of her younger brother, lost in the war. Margot learned that her hometown had been bombed, and many neighbors she had grown up with were gone. These words, meant to reconnect them with a world beyond Canada, instead reopened wounds. The women found themselves caught between gratitude for life and grief for what had been irretrievably lost. Visits from fellow ex-POWs became another mirror into their past. Stories of survival varied, some joyful, some harrowing, but each encounter forced the women to confront memories they had tried to bury. Anna listened as a friend recounted a daring escape attempt, the failures, the punishments, the tiny acts of defiance that had kept them alive. Margot nodded in silent understanding, realizing that survival had left scars that could not be removed, only acknowledged and lived with. Even news reports and tribunals reopened old chapters. Occasionally, newspapers detailed trials of former German officers or soldiers. Some of the women recognized faces, men whose authority had cast long shadows over their lives. The sight of these figures, alive and accountable for crimes, provoked a mixture of fear, anger, and vindication. Confronting the past in this way, though unsettling, became a step toward reclaiming control, an assertion that they were no longer powerless. Despite the haunting memories, resilience emerged in small, deliberate acts. Anna began to volunteer at a local center for refugees, helping women and children navigate life in a new country. Each smile she coaxed from someone frightened or uncertain was a victory against the lingering fear in her own chest. Margot wrote stories for the community newsletter, capturing fragments of memory, not to dwell on the pain, but to preserve courage and humanity. Through these actions, the women discovered that reclaiming dignity was less about forgetting the past and more about asserting life in spite of it. Therapy sessions, though rudimentary at first, offered another avenue for healing. Psychologists encouraged them to speak openly about their fears, nightmares, and anger. At first, the words caught in their throats, raw and resistant. But gradually, sharing became a form of liberation. Speaking aloud transformed pain into narrative, a story they could control rather than one that controlled them. There were still moments of unpredictability. A sudden loud noise, a slamming door, a backfiring truck could send women running to the nearest wall or huddling together, hearts hammering. Yet these reactions, once signs of terror, were slowly reframed as proof of survival, evidence that their bodies remembered. But their minds were learning to distinguish past from present. Small rituals offered comfort and control. Anna kept a journal, marking each day she woke without fear overwhelming her. Margot tended to a small garden, planting flowers that bloomed as tangible symbols of growth and renewal. They celebrated birthdays, community events, and even ordinary meals, finding joy in routines they had once taken for granted. Each act, ordinary to outsiders, became a statement. They had endured, survived, and could still flourish. By confronting the past, the women discovered that freedom was not a simple arrival, but a continuous negotiation. Memories of captivity remained, sometimes jagged and raw, but they were no longer all-consuming. Instead, they became part of a larger tapestry, threads of grief, resilience, courage, and hope. Anna and Margot learned to navigate the delicate balance between remembrance and forward motion, acknowledging trauma while creating lives that honored their survival. In quiet moments, they reflected on how far they had come. From the frost-covered barracks of Europe to the open fields of Canada, they had crossed more than distance. They had crossed fear, despair, and loss. Each challenge, each memory confronted, was another step toward reclaiming their humanity. And as the sun set over the Canadian hills, They felt a fragile but growing sense of peace, a reassurance that the past, though present, could no longer dictate the boundaries of their lives. Spring had settled fully over the Canadian landscape, and with it, a sense of life renewed. Anna walked through the town square, sunlight glinting off freshly painted rooftops, children laughing as they chased one another across the cobblestones. The air smelled of blooming flowers and wood smoke, a symphony of freedom she had once believed impossible. Margot followed close behind, a basket of bread balanced on her arm, smiling at neighbors whose faces had become as familiar and comforting as her own reflection. The women had begun to embrace their new lives fully. Some attended town celebrations, their laughter mingling with music that felt foreign yet welcoming. Others welcomed newly arriving refugees, guiding them through streets that had once seemed alien, offering blankets, food, and gentle words of encouragement. Little acts, planting flowers, sharing stories, helping children with lessons, became symbols of liberation, proof that they could shape a world not dictated by fear. Freedom had not erased the past, but it had given them the chance to reclaim their identities. Anna had learned to cook with joy rather than necessity. Margot had begun writing poetry, and together they celebrated milestones that once would have been unimaginable: birthdays, weddings, even the quiet triumph of a peaceful night's sleep. The war had shaped them, leaving scars and memories, but it could not define the fullness of their lives. Standing on a hill overlooking the snow-dusted valley, Anna and Margot breathed deeply, the wind carrying the scent of pine and possibility. They had crossed oceans, endured fear, and survived brutality, and now they were free to choose how to live. Their hearts, once heavy with despair, were now full of hope. In the vastness of Canada, among its welcoming people and endless skies, they had found not just safety, but the promise of life, resilient, unbroken, and undeniably their own.